Good afternoon. Today is July 16th, 2019. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Phil Santonzi, Director of Client Engagement Services at FloridaMakes. I welcome you to our FloridaMakes webinar series. FloridaMakes is the Florida member of the MEP National Network. MEP is the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, a program which runs out of the U.S. Department of Commerce and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Our mission is to improve the productivity and technological performance of Florida's manufacturing sector. Our work and services for Florida manufacturers are driven by individual company needs. If you would like to know more about us, please check out our website at www.floridamakes.com. As a participant, your audio today will be in listen-only mode using your phone or your computer, whichever is more convenient. There is an opportunity to ask your questions using the question pane. Add your questions there, and we'll address those as time allows at the end of the presentation. This is a live webinar event which will be recorded. A link to the recording will be provided to you within a few days. As we get started on today's presentation, we have a brief poll question for you. We'd like to get a sense of how many people are watching the webinar today. Please click your response on the screen. We'll take a few seconds to do that. Okay, Amanda, let's go ahead and see the responses. Okay. We got a pretty good feel for that. Okay, now to today's presentation. Today, you'll hear about planning your export business, the first of a four-part series of webinars providing guidance in export planning and implementation. The series includes Standards Conformity and Barriers to Trade on September 17th, Risk Management on November 19th, and Export Compliance on January 14th. Each year, U.S. companies export well over $2 trillion of goods and services. If you want your business to get in on the action, it's important to figure out the best way to expand to new markets. As with any business endeavor, however, exporting isn't without risk. Success comes from planning. Export readiness assessment, product selection, market selection, and the development of a market entry strategy are important parts of the export planning process, but there are other more subtle considerations as well. From cash flow and working capital to risk mitigation, from definitions of return on investment for you and your business to definitions of failure and the development of an exit strategy. This webinar, Planning Your Export Business, is designed to orient you to the major elements of export success. Today's speakers are Ken Mouradian and Sandro Murtas. As the director of the Orlando U.S. Export Assistance Center, Ken is responsible to facilitate the export of U.S. origin commodities, services, and technologies from 11 counties in Central Florida. He is also the executive secretary of the Central North Florida District Export Council. Ken has a Master of Arts degree in European Studies from the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in International Affairs there as well. Ken reads, writes, and speaks French fluently. Sandro Murtas is the regional manager of the Export Solutions Group for the Office of International Trade at the U.S. Small Business Administration in the Tampa U.S. Export Assistance Center, covering Central and Northern Florida. He is a certified global business professional by the North America International Trade Educators and a certified international credit professional by the Finance Credit International Business Association. I would like to now welcome Ken and Sandro to our webinar. Gentlemen.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my name is Ken Mouradian, and as was mentioned, I'm director of the Orlando U.S. Export Assistance Center. I'll be taking on this part of the presentation. If you could advance the slide, please. So during today's presentation, we're going to talk about export readiness, product selection, market entry strategy, export working capital, and risk mitigation. Before we do so, if we could take the next poll, please. Amanda? So what do you hope to gain from exporting? Do you hope to increase profitability, diversify sales, even out business cycles, or to be able to write off international travel on your taxes? Okay, so it looks like the majority of you want to diversify sales, followed by increased profitability, and then apparently being able to write off international travel on your taxes, which is interesting. That's apparently tied for number 2, and even out the business cycle. So let's go on to the next slide. In terms of export readiness, here are some reasons why people don't want to export. They consider it too risky, it can be cumbersome getting paid, or too complicated. The fact of the matter, though, is that export isn't a business unto itself. It's a revenue stream, it's a channel for sales, it's a marketing segment. So saying that it's too risky, too cumbersome, or too complicated is like saying it's too risky, cumbersome, or complicated being in business at all. Another reason that people cite for not exporting is that they don't need to export, or that they're too small to go global. Yet 42% of exporters have 19 or fewer employees. So it's hard to explain why it is that a small business would be too small to go global. And according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, 80% of the world's purchasing power, 92% of its economic growth, and 95% of its consumers are outside of the United States. So when you consider that your competitors are very likely exporting, especially given that 42% of exporters have 19 or fewer employees, if they are tapping into this large market potential and you're not, they have economies of scale that you don't have, and in the long run, they may be able to run you out of business just on price alone. So while it's true that you don't have to export, it's also true that you don't have to eat or drink water, and yet to be alive as a human being on the planet, we all know that that's not sustainable in the long run. Another reason that people cite for not exporting is that the product or service will not sell abroad, or they don't speak another language. Currently, at least, the global language of commerce is English. I'm going to assume that everybody on this call speaks English adequately well to be able to engage in international commerce. And there is a market for every product. So it's more a matter of export planning than it is absolute that your product or service will or will not sell well abroad. So let's talk about some of these other bullets, in terms of elements of export readiness: needing to have commitment for management and be prepared to fund export activities, understanding the added demands that international business can place on key resources, having realistic expectations regarding return on investment from international activities, and being prepared to modify products and services by market, as well as provide training after sales support. So what kind of commitment and funding issues are we talking about? Well, on average, it takes about 18 months and between $10,000 and $15,000 to enter a new export market. Now, obviously, as an average, that doesn't address every single company and every single product. This runs the gambit from toothpicks and pens and pencils on one extreme to Boeing aircraft or a fighter jet on the other extreme. But these are averages. In terms of resources, we're talking about, obviously, sales and marketing. If we're talking about channels of distribution, revenue stream, right? But we're also talking about accounts receivable, accounts payable, engineering from the perspective of export licensing, standards and regulatory conformity, product modification, and manufacturing, of course, and your ability to meet the demand from overseas markets. And finally, there are working capital considerations that we'll discuss soon. Now, I asked about the poll because I wanted to see some of the reasons that you might have for attending the seminar. Some potential reasons that you could have for exporting in terms of return on investment include growing sales, diversifying sales, increasing profitability, evening out the business cycle, fully and better using production capabilities, and defending the U.S. market. Some of these seem fairly obvious to me, but to put some flesh on these bones, some products are seasonal. It might be winter in the northern hemisphere, but it's summer in the southern hemisphere, and vice versa. In terms of diversifying sales, you're more vulnerable to the U.S. market risk if you're not exporting than you are if you are. By virtue of having other markets, when the U.S. economy is down, you have other sales channels to rely on to keep your company afloat. So while there really is no wrong answer to the poll, there is one answer that was thrown in there that I sometimes get from people, and that is that the owner of the company would like to be able to write off their international travel on their taxes. That is actually the one justification for export that's actually not a business justification. So I hope that those of you who answered that way were actually joking as much as I was joking when I asked that to be included in the poll. So if we can skip to the next slide, please. The product selection slide, there we are. Okay, great. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit beyond product when I start on this slide about competitive advantage in a broader sense. Competitive advantage can come from a product, but it can come from other aspects of your business, like speed to market or your ability to deliver in a more timely fashion. It can be things like customer service. It can be a whole range of things. But if it's valuable, whatever it is valuable to the market. If it's rare, if it's something that competitors have a difficult time imitating and it's something that your organization can leverage, then it's considered to be not just a competitive advantage, but a sustainable competitive advantage in the long term. So if you're familiar with VO analysis, you no doubt recognize what I just mentioned, but I'm going to actually use the acronym VRIO because it is a very simple way of determining not only whether a competitive advantage exists, but also whether it's sustainable in the long run. V stands for valuable, R stands for rare, I stands for imitate, and O stands for organization. If all four of these things exist, it's valuable, it's rare, it's difficult for competitors to imitate, and your organization can leverage it, then the competitive advantage is said to exist as a long-term competitive advantage. As you start peeling back these different layers, it goes from long-term to shorter term. For example, if it's valuable, rare, and your organization can leverage it, but it's easy to imitate, then the competitive advantage isn't sustainable in the long run. It exists, but it's not long-run sustainable. Thinking about your business in these terms can help you not only to understand product selection, but also market selection and start to strategize in terms of coming up with new bases for competitive advantage and coming out with new product and service offerings. Going to more of these other bullets here, in terms of selling points, when you're looking at the suite of products or services that your company offers, are they selling well domestically? Individual products, is it selling well domestically? And why? Things like social, cultural, economic, and political or environmental considerations that drive sales in the United States for that product can also drive sales in foreign markets and can help you to select a product for sale in a given export market. Similarly, modifications may be required to meet local standards and regulations. These may include testing, safety, quality, and technical conformity considerations, and FloridaMakes is especially well positioned to help you with these things. Does the product require an export license? The intellectual property in the product, is that your intellectual property? Is that somebody else's intellectual property? And does the foreign buyer need to obtain a license to use it? How about licenses to distribute the product in foreign markets? These may be things along the lines of medical devices or pharmaceutical medicines or other things of that nature. Understanding these matters certainly directs you towards certain products or certain export markets. How about training? Products that require training to operate place greater responsibility on your company and your distributor or agent, and you need to decide how to support training. After-sales service. Products that require considerable after-sales support need to be handled by a distributor or an agent who's well-positioned to provide these services. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. This starts to go into a bit of our channels of distribution slide, but we'll get there in a moment. Finally, product distinctiveness. A product or service has to be appropriate to the level of technology and wealth in the destination market. Some products that are in decline in the United States have markets abroad, and some foreign markets demand the most technologically advanced and distinct products available. Understanding the nature of your product and where it fits in the spectrum of technology will help to determine whether that product is appropriate to a given export market and whether that export market is appropriate to your product. If you have the latest, greatest, and it's the highest cost, then maybe it's not appropriate to a market whose level of wealth can't support it. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So product selection and market selection are really two sides of the same coin when you come right down to it. But there's a reality here, and that is that you can choose to identify markets based upon an educated guess, or you can choose to identify markets using a data-driven approach, and neither method is wrong or inadequate. It's a matter of personal preference and also what your stakeholders will accept. In terms of educated guessing, this is akin to licking your finger, putting it in the air, and seeing which way the wind blows. And as much as that might sound like a sarcastic comment, actually, nobody knows your business better than you. I don't. Sandro Murtos from SBA, who will speak soon, doesn't. Phil can't know your company better than you. You attend the trade shows. You read the trade press. You're talking to friendly competitors. You're talking to suppliers. You know that Xanadu is an upcoming market, and you know why it's an upcoming market. And to some extent, you don't need us to tell you that, right? So that's licking your finger, sticking it in the air, and by virtue of an educated guess, knowing where the market's going. But sometimes you want to be ahead of the wave. You want to be able to anticipate the market moves before everybody else. And that's where the data-driven approach comes in. And for this, the collective, we look at indicators of market potential that we find out about through conversations with you. So for some companies, their product requires cold storage. And there are certainly cold storage statistics out there. And cold storage isn't a one-size-fits-all thing. Depending what it is that you make, this may or may not be news to you, but you have to store pharmaceutical medicines differently from fisheries products. And you store pharmaceutical medicines and fisheries products differently from fruits and vegetables. So knowing that cold storage exists in that market is an important indicator of market potential. Knowing what kind of cold storage they have is also important. And if your product has to be maintained at a particular temperature, understanding the logistics infrastructure, and therefore knowing about the logistics performance index and what that means, is also an indicator of market potential. So if you understand the indicators for your company, if you're able to either develop this list yourself or work with us to develop this list, we can put these indicators on a spreadsheet as columns. And then if you say, well, you know, I'd like to explore the Asian market. You know, we're currently going gangbusters in Europe. And we're getting a lot of inquiries from South Asia. You know, we know about East Asian stuff, but we really haven't been thinking much about India, you know, Pakistan, Bangladesh, et cetera. We can put all the countries of South Asia as rows on a spreadsheet. We can pull the data, put it on the spreadsheet, normalize it so that things that aren't numeric can be put into a numeric form. We can get with you to find out which ones are relatively more important than the others, and therefore weight the data, and then add across the rows so we get a final score. And that's what enables you to rank order the markets. It doesn't mean that that's where you should go. Again, you need to go back to the common sense, you know your market best and your company best, but it certainly does help you to differentiate between, I don't know how many countries it could be, and the ones where you really want to spend your marketing dollars. So we'll take a look at some of these bullets, but I'm not going to beat a dead horse too much on any of them because we have other webinars coming up. So does your product require special infrastructure? Actually, I skipped the first one. Who's your buyer and why do they buy? Well, that has to do with a lot of the demographic considerations. Is it, a product that's geared toward men or women, elderly people, younger people, a more active or sporting lifestyle? These considerations drive indicators of market potential. What about the infrastructure? We talked about a logistics performance index. We talked about cold storage capacity. There may be other infrastructure issues that need to be taken into account. So does it sell for a premium price? Well, again, harkening back to the last slide, sometimes a product that's at the end of its life cycle in the U.S. may be in demand in a foreign country. Or it could be that they will not accept something that isn't state-of-the-art. So is the item destination end user or end use controlled? This gets to the whole question of export licensing. Knowing what countries are or are not controlled for your export commodity classification number, if it's controlled under the Export Administration regulations or under the ITAR, might help us to know whether this market is more or less attractive to you as a potential export market. So what about intellectual property rights? The U.S. Office of the U.S. Trade Representative publishes two separate name and shame lists. One of them is called the Special 301 Watch List. These are countries that are less naughty, but naughty nevertheless with regard to their respect for intellectual property and the adequacy of their enforcement regime. And then the really naughty ones are the Special 301 Priority Watch List. So that a country is or isn't on one of these lists may be an indicator of market potential. And because you can weight these indicators, it may not be a deal killer, but it may be something that makes a market less attractive to you. And let's see what else have we got here. Ease of doing business. Coface is an insurance company that has 29 variables that you can use individually, or there's aggregate score that you can use in terms of ease of doing business and also in terms of business risk. And then finally, barriers to trade. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, Foreign Agricultural Service has a document that goes by country and documents what kinds of barriers there are for agricultural exports. And then USTR and the U.S. Department of Commerce does that for other items. So I see that Phil has anticipated my saying next slide. In terms of market entry strategy, there are two methods you can use. There's direct versus indirect. Neither of them is better than the other. Indirect is, well, the difference between them has to do with where your buyer is located. If your buyer is located in the United States and that person is exporting it, it's an indirect channel. If the buyer is located overseas and you're the U.S. exporter, it is a direct export. The difference really has to do with the degree of complication, but also the profitability. Ultimately, your buyer is only willing and able to pay so much for your product. So the more hands that touch it, the lower your potential profit has to be in order for that price to not exceed the threshold your buyer is willing and able to pay. So you have things like confirming houses that are they're buyers on behalf of foreign governments, foreign corporations. You've got export trading companies which purchase items, take title to them, and export themselves. Export agents, merchants, or remarketers buy your stuff, take off marks and packaging to make it look like their product, and oftentimes integrate it into something and then resell it. These are examples of indirect. There are others. Examples of direct include sales representatives, sales agents, distributors in foreign markets, foreign retailers, or direct sales to end users and end use. Some of the market entry strategy considerations include terms of sale. I don't want to beat a horse too much about Incoterms, but these are three-letter acronyms that code for, where in the export process you versus your foreign buyer are organizing and paying for stuff. You can organize and pay to literally deliver the product onto their own dock at their facility in the foreign location, that's BDP, or you can arrange for them to pick it up on your dock and they do everything, that's XWorks, EXW, and there are 13 of them. My word of advice is make sure that you know what these mean. If you need help, come see me, come see Phil, come see Sandro, come see somebody. There are also third-party logistics companies that can quote you for customs, meaning customs clearance, insurance, meaning maritime insurance, and freight, meaning shipping, which is really what Incoterms are about. Other aspects of terms of sale deal with, payment terms, which we'll be talking about soon. I'm actually going to skip finance because we're going to talk about that soon as well. This is just on the slide for your reference. Market entry strategy also deals with intellectual property. The United States is one of only 5 countries that has common law for which use in commerce is relevant. Everywhere else, if you're not first to file, you're probably not going to become the right holder. And so you want to take account of the suite of your intellectual property assets when you're looking at entering a new market, and take steps to own as much of your business as possible, because if you let somebody else register your trademark, for example, when they're no longer your distributor, they still own your trademark. And it's more than that. It's your trade secret, which are things like price lists, pricing, methodologies, customer lists. If you sever your relationship with your distributor, whose property is this and how can it be used? So take these things in advance. Take these things into account in advance when developing a market entry strategy. You're probably already working with an attorney to develop your sales contracts. This is just part of a conversation you're already having. I'm going to skip down to standards and regulatory conformity and very briefly say that because you're manufacturers and you're working with an MEP somewhere, a manufacturing partnership somewhere, you are very likely already aware of things like CE mark or the General Data Protection Regulation or the China, the CCC. These are things that should figure into your market entry strategy as after sales support and export control. So we can skip to Sandro now. We'll talk a little bit about working capital.
Yes, thank you, Ken. I would like to also see if we can have the third poll before we introduce the finance aspect. And I would like to know, based on your experience or based on your plans, how will you negotiate with your potential foreign buyers or current buyers in terms of providing what options you provide for payments. I work, while you answer the questions, the poll, I work with the Small Business Administration. It's also a federal agency that works with a great majority of U.S. companies, which over 90% are small businesses. We provide different type of assistance, including counseling through our partners, such as BDCs, Women Business Centers, and Veteran Business Opportunity Centers. We also work with the small businesses that have an opportunity to sell to the federal government. And finally, we provide access to capital through our partners, the banks. And SBA, regarding small business exporter financing needs, has designed 3 programs that I will describe today to help banks provide funds for small businesses that are exporting, providing capital for working capital and term loans. So, yep, as I mentioned, cash in advance is one of the most common options, which could work for some industries that are less competitive. But if you are in a very competitive industry and you're going into a very competitive foreign market, that will limit your opportunities to make sales if you have competitors locally or from other countries that are providing credit terms to your buyers. Letters of credit is also a good option, especially when you're talking about custom-made products. And open accounts, very good option too. Once you have a very well-established relationship with your buyer, you make sure that they're financially stable and that you will not have any surprises. And also using insurance, we will describe it in a minute, is also a good option to allow you to provide credit to your buyers without incurring in excessive risk. So going to the working capital, we can go back to the slide. Banks can provide you with lines of credit, and SBA works with the banks to provide lines of credit for small business exporters. We actually have two programs, the Export Express and the Export Working Capital Program, that provide the bank with a 90% guarantee when they make a line of credit available to small business exporters. The Export Express is one of the most flexible programs. It's basically a line of credit that goes up to $500,000. It has a 90% guarantee up to $350,000, and between that amount and $500,000, the guarantee is 75%. How can you use the line of credit? You can use it to finance export transactions, but you can also use the funds to pay for market development expenses. For example, you're going to a trade mission, you're going to an international trade show, you're sending samples to your potential clients. You need to modify the product to comply with the requirements from the country where your buyer is located. All those expenses can be financed through the line of credit, and also you can still use part of the line of credit, about 30%, for domestic needs. So 70% will be used for all the expenses related to making sales or market development in foreign markets, and the 30% can still be used for domestic purposes. And this is a line of credit that is, like I said, very flexible, and it's a great solution for a company that is making the or taking the first steps into international markets, and because of its flexibility. In addition, banks that have our delegated authority to make the Export Express have a great flexibility in terms of documentation and processing. So it's a great solution, and it's something that you might want to discuss with your lender. The next program that we have is the Export Working Capital Program. Once you develop sales and your export sales are growing, and you're seeing that your cash flow for the domestic operation is becoming tight because you need more working capital for your export sales, you can graduate to the Export Working Capital Program. This line of credit goes up to $5 million. So it's a great amount of money that you have available to finance your export sales. It has a guarantee of 90% from the SBA to the bank. This line can only be used to finance export transactions. If you need money for market development, you cannot. The line cannot provide you with that working capital for that purpose. You can still use the Export Express. You can use the line of credit to finance purchase orders. You go to a trade show, you meet a lot of potential buyers, and you actually generate purchase orders from those foreign buyers, and you need working capital. By using the line, you can go to your bank and get an advance of up to 90% against that PO. Or you already made some sales, you have new purchase orders coming in, you need working capital. You can take the foreign account receivables, take them to your bank, and get an advance of up to 90% against that account receivable. Or the line can be issued as an asset-based line of credit. And basically, especially if you are a manufacturer, you have inventory, you have foreign account receivables, you can pull them together, create a borrowing-based certificate with your export inventory and your foreign account receivables, and you can take monthly that borrowing-based certificate to your bank, and you can get up to 75% against export inventory and up to 90% against foreign account receivables. So this line can solve a lot of working capital needs for a small business without affecting the cash flow and the working capital for the domestic operations. Again, this is business, so to do business, you need money, and this, when you get involved into international trade, this is a great solution to solve your working capital needs. Another program that SBA has is the International Trade Loan. As you grow your export sales, you're gonna probably need more facilities, more equipment. You might have that you want to refinance. And if you're exporting, SBA has a program called the International Trade Loan, which in its domestic version gives the bank a 75% guarantee. But if the company is exporting, getting ready to export, or is an indirect exporter, which means they're selling domestically to a buyer who is in turn re-exporting the product, that qualifies them for the 90% guarantee. And an indirect exporter can qualify also for the Export Express and also for the Export Working Capital Program. So these programs with a higher guarantee, since because we understand that small businesses that are involved in international trade are incurring more risk. For that reason, we provide the bank with a 90% guarantee to give extra comfort to the banks when they're dealing with small business exporters. We also have another partner agency, which is the Export-Import Bank of the United States. They also offer the Export Working Capital Program. They go from above $5 million without any limits on the amount, and they also don't have restrictions in terms of size of the company. If you're not to qualify for or to be eligible for an SBA loan, you need to be a small business. We will look at your sales or number of employees. Exim Bank does not have any limitations. On the other hand, they require the domestic content for the products and services that are being re-exported. So at least 51% must be US made. SBA does not have that restriction. We understand that the world has changed and companies are sourcing products in other markets or components. We don't have restrictions in terms of that, but yes, we do require that all the export shipments are made from the US. Also, the state of Florida has another working capital solution for companies, small businesses. They are still not ready to access export finance through a bank. The Florida Export Finance Corporation will provide a guarantee to the bank to provide that line of credit to the small business, and that line of business can go up to $500,000. So if you're not ready yet, you're not bankable, as we say, the Florida Export Finance Corporation can be an alternative to access working capital for export transactions. Next slide, please. We were talking about risk, and we were talking about in the poll the different options that you have when you're selling internationally in terms of how you're going to get paid. So one recommendation that we make is always to explore insurance for the foreign account receivables. You can protect your receivables against commercial risk, the risk of non-payment by your buyers, and also political risks, something that happens in a country. It doesn't have necessarily to be political. It could be, you're selling to the Caribbean, there is a hurricane, everything is lost because of the great damage, you can get reimbursed, even though the non-payment is caused by a natural disaster. Exim Bank provides to qualified small businesses that meet the domestic content requirement. They can provide insurance for the foreign account receivables, but if you fall in the category of companies that have or do not comply with the domestic requirement, there are also private insurance providers. These are insurance companies that really are not concerned with the domestic content, and they can insure your receivables, even though your product is not U.S. made. Another option, especially when we're talking about capital goods that are high ticket items, let's say equipment of, from $50,000 and up, $100,000 to $100,000. One of the challenges for foreign buyers is accessing financing. They want to buy the equipment from a U.S. company, but they cannot get financing from the seller, or they cannot get financing in the local market, in the foreign market. The Exim Bank has agreements with banks in the U.S. and in foreign markets to provide a guarantee to those banks in order to make a loan to the foreign buyer to buy the U.S.-made equipment or product. So that is another option, again, especially when we're talking about high-value exports. Very important, and sometimes we forget that we're moving goods around the world. And if you watch the news from time to time, you will see, because of weather conditions, large container ships that are dumping containers, and that is an eventuality that might happen. And we want to make sure that when you're involved in international trade, you are getting insurance for transportation. If something happens, you will be protected. So if you're shipping something of great value, you need to make sure that either you or the buyer are getting insurance for any eventuality. And if you're getting involved with letter of credit, the bank will assure that insurance is included. And especially if you're getting a line of credit and you're financing your export sales through that, the bank will need to make sure that insurance is in place. So it's very important to take into account that exporting involves risks, just like domestic transactions. And you want to make sure that you're protecting your business. If you're a large corporation, you have a loss. Well, if you have enough cash reserves, you can absorb that loss. But if you're a small business, you want to make sure that if something happens, you're protected. Ken, I will let you continue with the next item.
Great, yes, thank you. So also under risk mitigation, we have partner qualification. And when we're talking about partner qualification, we're really actually talking about what's important to your stakeholders and not purely data unto itself. So what I'm going to say is that my agency, which is the U.S. Commercial Service for part of the International Trade Administration within the Commerce Department, or the commercial section of an embassy, we can actually research a foreign company to include the form of their business organization, the company's history, the background and qualification of the principals, the company's financials, their banking relationships, their business relationships, and what we think of the company. Do we think that our company you should do business with? It's not the same thing as your due diligence. Your due diligence includes other things that are important to your stakeholder. But we can do that research for you. That is a fee-based product. It's relatively inexpensive. If that's not something you're interested in pursuing, I can certainly tell you how to find some of this information yourself. But ultimately, when you talk about risk mitigation, knowing that this is a company that you want to do business with is important from the perspective of payment and also from the perspective of export compliance. That has to do with complying with U.S. export controls. Now, the next item on this slide, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that sounds kind of scary, and it's probably going to appear a little bit scary when I first explain it, but there's a purpose behind it. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a law that's directed at you as the exporter. It makes it illegal for you to offer or pay a bribe to a specific class of people for a specific purpose. The class of people are foreign governments. That includes parastatal corporations. So if you're interested in exporting to China, for example, where almost everything is a parastatal corporation, this is something to consider. So that's the class of people, government. The specific activities for the purpose of obtaining or retaining business. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is silent on what's considered, quote, facilitating payments. That is to say, potentially, I hate to say paying a bribe to get things through customs, but that's actually potentially illegal under the laws of the export market, under U.S. law, other than the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but that's not covered by the FCPA. I bring up the FCPA here because if you're exporting through an intermediary, like a sales agent or a distributor or a sales representative, it may be true that in their country that's how it's done, but it's also true that their actions and activities can create liability for your company. So the Commerce Department doesn't give legal advice. I'm not going to give you legal advice here. I'm going to give you general business counsel. My general business counsel begins with saying, have a discussion with your attorney about how best to create an FCPA compliance program as part of your contract and interaction with your foreign business partner. This may include language in your contract that obligates the business partner to not violate the act, that requires an affirmative statement that they've received it, they read it, they understand it, and they promise they're not going to violate it. That may also include periodic documented conversations. Maybe you visit your distributor once a year and you visit the market and see your buyers once a year. Well, while you're there, you have your FCPA chat, as it were, and then you document that you've had the chat. And that may also include something under breach of contract that pertains to violations of the FCPA, so that if it were to happen, not that it's going to happen, but if it were to happen, and the U.S. government found out about it and you were brought up on some sort of a charge, you would have some form of a legal defense. And, you know, again, I'm trying not to give legal advice. So the bottom line is the discussion to have with your attorney around structuring your relationship with your foreign business partners to cover your behind. So that's why I put that under the risk mitigation slide. And then finally, a destination control statement. Most exports don't require an export license, yet everything, literally everything in the economy falls under the commodity jurisdiction of the U.S. government. That includes pens and pencils and office supplies and things. The difference is that things that are available in a general retail environment are usually classified as EAR 99, meaning that they are not, they don't have special licensing requirements on the basis of what they are, right? So for things though that are controlled specifically on the basis of what they are, because they have an ECCN number or they're controlled under the ITAR, or for things that are destined for countries that have trade sanctions against them, you may need to apply for an export license. And the U.S. government requires the use of canned language in your invoice, bill of lading, airway bill, or other export control document that accompanies a shipment from its point of origin in the United States to the ultimate consignee or end user abroad. My non-legal but business advice would be to just add the statement in anyway. It doesn't necessarily hurt you. It's extra verbiage on a piece of paper, but if you needed it, because you didn't violate U.S. law, but somebody else did, it's nice to have. So what I've got here is a version of the canned language that came from the Bureau of Industry and Security. That's a different bureau of the Commerce Department from the one that I work for, but they are the bureau that administers the U.S. Export Administration Regulations. And the canned language reads, these commodities, technology, or software were exported from the United States in accordance with the Export Administration Regulations. Diversion is contrary to U.S. law, or diversion contrary to U.S. law is prohibited. And according to BIS, if it's something that's actually ITAR controlled, but it also contains pieces, parts that may be EAR controlled, then you use the ITAR export control statement, which I also happen to have here. And that reads, these items are controlled by the U.S. government and authorized for export only to the country of ultimate destination for use by the ultimate consignee or end user, with the S in parentheses, herein identified. They may not be resold, transferred, or otherwise disposed of to any other country or any other person than authorized ultimate consignee or end user, either in their original form or after being incorporated into other items without first obtaining approval from the U.S. government, or as otherwise authorized by U.S. law or regulation. So I don't want to beat a dead horse, but these are things to consider. We have a whole presentation on risk management coming up in this series. So if you can advance the slide. All right, so this slide is about resources. Where can you get help? Of course, you are already familiar with FloridaMakes. You already know that they can help you with standards conformity. You already know they can help you with best-in-class manufacturing. You already know how to reach them. Under U.S. Department of Commerce, I provided the general number for my office there, as well as the website for my agency within the Commerce Department. But there are other agencies that can help you, including the Bureau of Industry and Security, which administers certain export controls. NIST, of course, is the National Institute of Standards and Technology that works with FloridaMakes. There's the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office that can help you with intellectual property monitoring and enforcement in foreign markets. There are a suite of services, and my office can be a gateway to that. Enterprise Florida is our counterpart at the state of Florida. They used to be called the Florida Department of Commerce. They were turned into a public-private corporation under Governor Bush. They have a suite of services to include Florida pavilions and major trade shows, as well as a suite of grants that can help to pay for foreign standards conformity, participation in trade shows, or even some of my agency's fee-based partner identification services. So they're an excellent resource. That's their main number. That's their website. Of course, Sandro is here from the Small Business Administration. You heard from him a few moments ago. He also talked about the Export-Import Bank of the United States and Florida Export Finance Corporation. We've made passing reference to the Florida Small Business Development Center. In Central Florida, that is the University of Central Florida College of Business, doing business as. They have access to the full suite of research tools of the entire university. They are MBAs from very prestigious programs. They oftentimes come from the world of hard knocks, having done it themselves. They really do understand how to engage you. They can help you to develop an export marketing plan. Under a grant from the state of Florida, they can create one for you. They have an advisory board service they can organize. It's an excellent resource. That's the number for the FSBDC in Orlando and their URL. World Trade Center Orlando is a private membership-based organization. What's different from the WTCO versus the rest of the resources I have up on the slide is that they help with imports too. Since you're manufacturers, I'm going to assume that you're importing raw materials to some extent and that you are processing them into products and services and commodities, whether they're actually end products. So I put the WTCO up there on that slide. There are other World Trade Centers throughout the state. That's not the only one. And then Central Florida International Trade Office is a function of Orange County government. It's also partially paid by J.P. Morgan Stanley, if I'm not mistaken. They do not exclude companies that are not in Orange County. So if you're not in Orange County, you can still tap them. and they have quite a bit of bandwidth to help with research and partner identification. So those are some of the resources that are available to you in the state. And if you can advance the slide, I wonder if you don't have any questions. Actually, you know what, before I go to questions, there was one resource I should have mentioned, and that's the Central North Florida District Export Council. The DEC is a body of individuals who have been appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. They serve 4-year terms. They're volunteers. They are not paid. And the purpose of the DEC is to amplify the business consulting services of the U.S. Export Assistance Center, so my office. They also service the territory of North Florida from Jacksonville to Panhandle in West Florida, from my office's territory all the way down to Fort Myers and Sanibel Island, et cetera. So these are people from the exporting public. If you want to know how they handled a specific problem that you have right now, they're an excellent resource, and you can reach them by reaching out to me. So, questions?
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Sandro. We do have a question for you. We're running short on time here, but we've got time at least for one, I think, or maybe two. One question is, what if my bank tells me no to a loan? Where else can I get information about lenders?
Yes. If that is the situation, again, discussing an SBA guarantee with the bank could be an option. You know, just make sure you always bring it up. And SBA in its web page has a list of lenders that are the most active with our programs. Just a reminder, it's the bank that applies for the SBA guarantee. But you always want to bring it up, especially for these special programs that I mentioned. And if you have any questions, you have my information, you can reach out to me, and we'll be more than glad to introduce you to some lenders that are very knowledgeable with our programs.
Okay, thanks. And the last question that we'll ask here is, how do I find out what's necessary in the way of compliance for overseas sales, like CE marks or other industry standards?
Well, that's an interesting question, because that's actually something that I would put to you as FloridaMakes. For the benefit of the general audience, you know, FloridaMakes has a partnership with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they have a knowledge of engineering that I'm not going to have as a guy who is trained more in law and economics than engineering. Now, that being said, my agency is the commercial section of an embassy, and National Institute of Standards and Technology has standards attaches with regional responsibility, forward position at specific embassies. So the person in Brussels, Belgium, for example, handles the entirety of the European Union and broader European Economic Area, and may go into countries like Turkey as well. So if you wanted to talk to a standards attaché or a standards commercial specialist with very specific knowledge of a specific standard or a notified body or a regulator or an upcoming law that deals with a standard or a regulation, that's something that I can actually organize for you. And then the question that wasn't asked is, what if the standard is arbitrary or seemingly intended to benefit the domestic producer? That is what our agency is here for. It's here specifically to help you to find distribution, but also defend your commercial interests. So we absolutely do engage and use our influence in international bodies, et cetera, to get the foreign company to effectively cut it out. So anyway.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Sandro. We look forward to the next 3 webinars in this export series. Standards Conformity and Barriers to Trade will be on September 17th, Risk Management on November 19th, and Export Compliance on January 14th. As noted earlier, the recording of this webinar will be provided to all attendees within a few days. I thank all for attending today. As you exit the webinar, we ask please that you complete the survey. We're seeking your feedback on how to improve these webinars and to better meet your needs with topics of value to you. Good day, everyone. This ends the webinar.